From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. Today we're going to be talking about Syria and touching on U.S. policy, the situation in Idlib, and the dilemma facing the Syrian Kurds, among other issues. To discuss the situation, I'm joined by two excellent guests, both colleagues of mine here at MEI, Robert Ford and Charles Lister. Robert is a senior fellow at MEI and Yale's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs, and a former U.S. ambassador to Syria. Charles is a senior fellow and the director of MEI's Countering Terrorism and Extremism program. Thank you both for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Charles, there's been an awful lot going on lately, both within Syria as well as externally on the diplomatic front. What are the key recent developments as you see it?
Everyone is scrambling right now to either fill the vacuum from the US withdrawal or on our end to figure out what a US withdrawal looks like and to come towards some kind of a solution in terms of who fills that vacuum and fulfills our continued interests in securing and enduring defeat of ISIS, in at least in some way protecting the Kurds from either attack from Turkey or from the regime. And I think there's so many tracks of negotiations going on now. Most of them are not being publicly reported, but they're all focused on exactly that situation. I mean, we just hosted the SDC executive head, Ilham Ahmed, here at the Middle East Institute a couple of days ago. I think she made that very clear. She acknowledged they were negotiating separately with Russia, with Damascus, with the US, and with our allies in the region on potential paths forward, only one of which would theoretically work. So, yeah, it's a mad scramble. And I think out of that, the one interesting thing we've seen is, I think, a slowing down of a timetable on the US end. Certainly in my discussions with DoD people shortly after Trump's announcement, the indication was we'd see signs of a withdrawal happening pretty quickly. And that was with the 4-month timeline, not the original 30-day one. We've still seen no signs of a withdrawal now, no clear signs of a real withdrawal. So I do think that 4-month timeline is going to be extended somewhat.
Robert, what's your read on the situation in regards to the U.S. troop withdrawals? Are you hearing the same thing? Do we have any sense from your side of what the timeline will actually look like or how that process will work?
The Defense Department is working on plans. They've withdrawn a small amount of equipment, but they don't have a large number of people to withdraw. It's only a couple of thousand. So they can do that fairly quickly once the decision is made to start. In a sense, this lies between the president, who I think would like to get out sooner, not later, and people in the national security bureaucracy, particularly the Defense Department and the State Department, who would like to get out later, not sooner. In these kinds of internal arguments, the president always wins. So it's really just a question of President Trump's patience. And that's hard to know in advance.
I would just add on to that. I think Robert's point is largely right about the president always winning, although I would say the president originally demanded a withdrawal within 30 days, and it took just a few days to force that to be quadrupled to 4 months. And in my discussions with DoD officials, they made it pretty clear that even though 4 months was agreed, their indication was it was likely going to be at least 6. That was then. So I think, yes, there's going to be a withdrawal. The president has won that debate. But the question of how that withdrawal takes place is the big question within the US government at the moment, and what withdrawal actually means. As far as the president is concerned, I think withdrawal means we have 0 people left on the ground and in the air. I don't think we're going to reach that point. I really don't think we're going to reach that point in a strict way anyway. So in that sense, I think there is still some way of bending the president on some of these issues. As I think we've just been hearing from some news this morning, the president's expected to address this in his State of the Union address. So presumably we might hear a little bit more about that then.
So wait and see what he says in the speech. Yeah. Shifting gears a little bit, Charles, the Wall Street Journal is reporting that the U.S. is trying to assemble an international coalition to create a buffer zone in northern Syria, kind of post-withdrawal. How plausible does that seem against the background of this uncertainty over the U.S. withdrawal? And do you think the U.S. is likely to have much luck getting anyone to kind of sign up for that?
Well, we're pushing for something with very little leverage or influence, frankly. Our European allies have been pretty exasperated at the fact that they weren't consulted about this withdrawal announcement in the first place. They've been left with far more security concerns than the United States has in terms of their significant numbers of foreign terrorist fighters in custody in northeastern Syria and their fate. France is potentially about to have to take nearly 200 back, which is a huge undertaking, and they're certainly not happy about that. Never mind the fact that France and the UK have troops on the ground. So I think it's going to be a very big ask, frankly. I don't think there will be much appetite within Europe to deploy the kind of numbers of forces, even though, as Robert says, they're relatively small when we compare other previous conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere, to fill the shoes, given the uncertainty about what Syria is going to look like going forward, with much less of a US influence and almost a negligible presence on the ground. It's a big risk to take, in a sense. I think there was always a faith in the fact that 2,000 troops meant that there was a certain amount the US would do to keep that region stable if things got really bad. With no US troops on the ground and with a US president who has made it clear in no uncertain terms he doesn't care particularly much about Syria, I'm not sure how much the Europeans are going to have faith in the idea of the US continuing to provide air cover if things get bad, and to what extent we continue to be able to stave off the regime in Russia from offering a better long-term deal to the Syrian Democratic Forces than we can offer in what looks basically like a stopgap.
On the Russian front as well, I wanted to ask about the idea that Vladimir Putin recently floated during Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's visit to Moscow, which is the idea of reviving this 1998 Adana Agreement, a Turkish-Syrian deal to promote cooperation against the Kurdistan Workers' Party. Does that seem like it might work? And do you see any kind of potential for a broader rapprochement between Damascus and Ankara at this point?
Well, it's an interesting question. I've kind of been struggling over it for the last few days since it really became part of the news. I mean, I think I've seen quite a bit of reporting from inside Turkey that has suggested, in some ways, when you look back at what the Adana Protocol used to look like and what it might look like in renewed terms, skepticism as to whether or not it would actually be enforceable and useful to sustain the real kind of strategic interests that at least the kind of hard-line conservative wing of the Turkish government wants to achieve in Syria. I think it's an intriguing way for the Russians to try and square the circle between Turkey and Damascus, and that circle does need to be squared for Russia. There is still a fairly significant amount of animosity between Ankara and Damascus. I don't think we should see that overshadowed. But at the end of the day, as we heard from Ilham Ahmed here at the Middle East Institute, they are being given the signal from the US and from our other allies, both in the region and in Europe, that that's kind of a non-starter, and that the proposal that we are trying to put forward with the support of some of our allies in the region and with the Europeans is something really quite different. That might potentially include Turkey, and Ilham Ahmed's inclusion of Turkey within that equation was fascinating to me. I've never heard her propose the idea of a potential agreement with Turkey and the US being better than a potential agreement with Damascus and Russia. So watch that. I don't think it's the most likely scenario, but it's intriguing that she's here and still buying into that potentiality.
Robert, back in the U.S., we're seeing increasing pushback on the administration's Syria policy in Congress. What's your read on the dynamic between the administration and Congress at this point?
Well, the Congress is not united. That's not a surprise. And there are people on both sides of the aisle taking two different sets of positions. There is a part of the Congress, in both the Senate and the House, that want President Trump to go more slowly with the withdrawal for two reasons. Some think that if the Americans stay longer, it will be easier to have an enduring end to the Islamic State. No strategy explained in how that would be done, but it's just a belief. And then there's also a group who want to delay the withdrawal because they think we should defend the Kurds. They have now identified that there is an American national security interest in defending Syrian Kurds. There is another part of the Congress, though, that says we need to leave promptly, and that includes people from Republican Rand Paul in the Senate to far liberal Democrats in the House. So that gives the White House, because of the divisions in Congress, that gives the White House, the administration, some wiggle room so that I don't think Congress is going to be able to force the president's hand one way or the other.
Robert, I wanted to ask about the issue of the Syrian Kurds. One of the things that Ilham Ahmed said when she was here earlier this week is that the Syrian Kurds are considering a backup plan with the Assad regime in which the Syrian Democratic Forces would, in effect, kind of join their forces with the Syrian military in exchange for some sort of democratic reforms, some degree of regional autonomy. What options do the Syrian Kurds have at this point, and does a deal with Moscow or Damascus seem like the most plausible outcome going forward?
In the end, the Syrian Kurds will have to make some kind of arrangement with the Syrian government in Damascus. The Syrian government in Damascus is not going away. No one on planet Earth recognizes the Syrian Kurds as an independent state. Even their best friends in Washington still say they are part of Syria. And so sooner or later, they will have to deal with Damascus. Their leverage is not great, and it is diminishing, I think, with time, especially as the American withdrawal approaches. And so I think there's a risk that the Syrian Kurds might overplay their hand. We have certainly seen their cousins in Iraq do that on repeated occasions. So how much autonomy they can leverage out of Damascus, I think, is a big question. And I have to be frank, there is nothing in the Ba'athist ideology that surrounds the government in Damascus that suggests that the Syrian government would accept much autonomy. Baathism is a very centralizing political ideology. It has no room for decentralization. It has no room for federalism. It has no room for local autonomy. There's a reason that Damascus discriminated so heavily against the Syrian Kurds in the past, basically said, you will be Arabs, doggone it, no matter what. And so you have to have a certain amount of human sympathy for the situation the Syrian Kurds are in. I think their best hope over the long term for something durable is to try to secure sort of non-political rights and get that set down clearly and respected. And that would be everything from language rights to the rights of other Syrian citizens, for example, owning property, being able to buy and sell property. Damascus used to discriminate against the Syrian Kurds on that. A lot of Syrian Kurds couldn't even get passports, and they weren't recognized as Syrian citizens. And I think that kind of minimum set of demands, probably they could get some kind of acknowledgement from Damascus about. But local taxation, local budget decisions on education curriculum with no input from Damascus, I think that's going to be much harder.
I agree entirely. And I think one of the other things that struck me from Ilham Ahmed's visit here was her sense of confidence about the fact that they can still work something out that suits their kind of maximalist interests. She did end the whole session by saying, you know, if not, and if everything doesn't work out, we'll go back to resistance, which was probably bluster more than anything. I think what Robert says is true. They will, in the end, choose one settlement over another rather than no settlement and resistance, at which point I think they risk losing everything. But her real sense that, you know, the US is still our best ally, despite us having quite dramatically let them down in this fashion, certainly in terms of losing their leverage. And the idea that they can work out this kind of magical settlement with Turkey did really strike me. And in a way, I think she was falling into the same trap that, frankly, much of the Syrian opposition has fallen through for the last 7 or 8 years, of this kind of false sense of confidence about what they can achieve with relatively minimal equipment and leverage and influence on their side.
Switching gears from the northeast to Idlib, I wanted to ask about the situation there. Under the terms of the deal that Turkey and Russia had worked out, Turkey was supposed to root out the extremist groups like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Not only has that not happened, but HTS is now in control of Idlib, and Russia's been issuing warnings. Where do you see this going from here?
Well, part of me actually thinks, in a horribly ironic sense, that HTS's almost entire takeover of the northwestern region may actually have helped stabilize it further. There's been a great deal of reporting recently that their takeover will result almost certainly in an offensive. And some of Russia's messaging has indicated that. But a lot of what I'm being told is Russia's recent messaging is actually just encouraging Turkey to work harder on trying to create now a new kind of settled, somewhat stable northwestern scenario. And that we're now starting to see being negotiated on the ground. Again, not being publicly reported, but the Turks are mediating negotiations between HTS and the rest of the Syrian opposition groups in that area, the Syrian interim government, which is a kind of mainstream governance body, and the Salvation Government, which is HTS's civilian governing body, and trying to negotiate the formation of some kind of military council to run all of the armed presence, and with the military council almost certainly being placed under the command of a Turkish proxy, not HTS, probably someone within the Muslim Brotherhood kind of arena, and a civilian body which would be led probably by HTS's Salvation Government. Some kind of compromise scenario which presumably the Russians would see as better if it was stable than an all-out offensive. You know, Russia is still in a phase, and we've talked about this in previous podcasts, Russia is really still in a phase where it wants to pivot talk away from conflict and towards politics, towards refugee return, reconstruction, re-engagement with the regime. Now is just about the worst time that it could take to initiate what would be really kind of an apocalyptic military offensive in the northwest with the fate of at least 3 million civilians at stake. And so I've been surprised by Russia's patience until now, but I suspect we may continue to see that patience, at least for some period of time, to give the Turks another chance, another one, to try and create some kind of a scenario that's better than that last one.
On the issue of ISIS, in terms of its territorial control, Charles, it's now down to its last 2 villages, I believe, in Syria. But they've still been able to carry out some quite high-profile attacks, most notably in Manbij. Are we approaching an inflection point where we'll see a shift from the military campaign to a counterterrorism one? And what's the administration's strategy for dealing with ISIS in Syria going forward?
Well, on the first part of your question, yes. I mean, I think we've already seen that pivot in a large respect. I think what we're seeing in these last 2 villages is a kind of a holdout by the hardest of hardcore ISIS fighters who are truly there to die until the end, or to fight until death. But I think almost that's become a sideshow now in terms of, you know, if I put my terrorism analyst hat on, the real issue at heart now is what's ISIS doing next, and to what extent has it positioned itself to be able to successfully sustain a kind of guerrilla terror insurgency, the like of which we saw in Manbij with the killing of 4 American personnel. I think all of the indications from Iraq, and the campaign in Iraq was almost like a year ahead of the campaign we've had in Syria. And the indication we've seen in Iraq is they've quite successfully adapted themselves towards that new phase of operation. And I would fear and suspect that they've probably been similarly effective at preparing for that in Syria. When you listen and you look back to a lot of what SDF people have been saying over the last 12 to 18 months, they've made it no secret. You know, they are spending as much energy on the frontline fight against ISIS as they are chasing down sleeper cells all across the liberated territories, what they call the liberated territories. I think that is going to be a very significant source of concern. So the second part of your question, what's the administration's plan? Well, frankly, we don't have one. If you talk to the DoD, they have a new mission now. The mission is withdrawal. And that is going to take up an increasing amount of their energy and their thinking. So the responsibility for pushing back against the guerrilla insurgency is going to be placed in the hands of the SDF, who have much more minimal resources and have, frankly, not so much of the bandwidth right now when they're trying to, as I was saying earlier, focusing on running multiple tracks of negotiations with different governments. So I fear, actually, that in many respects, the withdrawal announcement coming without any consultation, with no plan, couldn't have come at a worse time for the campaign in Syria, given the fact that we are at this pivot point. That is exactly the worst point at which to start this discussion of leaving, before we get a grip on how to, exactly as you say, how to draw up a plan to deal with that next phase, which actually is much more difficult than a conventional military fight and forcing ISIS out of overtly controlled territory.
Robert, a number of Arab states have begun reestablishing and normalizing their diplomatic ties with Damascus. The U.S. has resisted this, of course. Do you see any chance that this will change in the near term? And what do you think it would take for the U.S. to soften its stance?
I want to get to that point about reintegration of the Syrian government into the international community, Alistair, but I want to add one point to what Charles was saying about ISIS. I think it's really important for our listeners who are interested in U.S. policy to consider that we have about 5,000 to 6,000 U.S. forces in Iraq. Nobody's talking about withdrawing them. And yet ISIS is able to conduct some level of counter-government activities, insurgency, terrorism. It is important to understand that whether or not American troops stay in Syria 4 months or 6 months or 1 year, American troops, whether in Iraq or in Syria, cannot fix the ISIS problem. We need to be realistic about our limits and our capabilities. Iraqis are going to have to fix it over in Iraq. They know the country, they know the terrain, they know the people. And it's going to have to be Syrians in Syria. I take Charles's point about limited resources of the SDF, which leads me to think the organization with bigger resources, for better or worse, is the Syrian government. And how you get them to take the lead in this, I think, is a better question. So talking about the Syrian government and reintegrating it, the Emiratis, Abu Dhabi, has already announced it's going to reopen its embassy. Some Gulf states never fully closed their embassies, Kuwaitis, for example. And it's easy to imagine that little by little, we're going to start seeing some business missions, Emirati business people, Kuwaitis, maybe some Bahrainis even, to talk about specific projects. But the investment climate in Syria was never great even before the uprising started. And I don't think it's a lot better now. Certainly the infrastructure is a lot worse. And so I wouldn't expect to see a massive rush of Arab Gulf businessmen or Arab Gulf officials flooding into Damascus. Rather, I think it'll be very incremental and will sort of quickly reach limits. With respect to reintegrating the Syrian government into the broader international community, I think that is very far away. People in Washington may disagree about whether or not the United States should withdraw quickly or later, sooner or later from Syria, but I don't think there's anybody who says we should reopen an American embassy in Damascus and start dealing with Bashar al-Assad again. Actually, quite to the opposite. In the Congress, there's still strong support for taking whatever measures can be taken to hold Assad and his ruling clique accountable for war crimes that they are, by all accounts, guilty of committing. So the reintegration of the Syrian government into the broader world community, I think that is something that is going to take years and years.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Robert, Charles, thank you both for joining us today. And thank you as well to our audience for listening in and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see you all next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.